at 70. Her hands weren't as steady as they used to be, but years of practice made the familiar motion almost meditative. The quiet of her modest home was broken only by the gentle ticking of the antique wall clock, a wedding gift from what felt like several lifetimes ago, and the occasional distant sound of carolers making their way through the neighborhood. She paused her chopping to adjust the small radio on her windowsill, its tinny speakers struggling to fill the kitchen with silent night. The irony wasn't lost on her. Silence had become an unwelcome companion since Robert's passing 3 years ago. Their home, once filled with the chaos of family gatherings and the laughter of grandchildren, had grown still. Their son James had moved to Seattle with his family, and while the video calls were nice, they couldn't replace the warmth of a real embrace. Clara wiped her hands on her worn apron and glanced at the small turkey breast thawing by the sink, a far cry from the enormous bird she used to prepare when the whole family would gather. She had considered not cooking at all this year, but some traditions were worth maintaining, even in solitude. Besides, leftovers would keep her fed through the week ahead. The first knock was so faint she almost missed it. Clara turned down the radio, cocking her head to listen. There it was again, a hesitant tapping at her front door. Strange, she thought, straightening her cardigan. Most of her neighbors were away for the holidays, and carolers usually announced themselves with song. When she opened the door, the bitter December wind wasn't the only thing that took her breath away. There, on her doorstep, stood a boy who couldn't have been more than 9 or 10. His thin jacket hung in tatters around his slight frame, and his dark eyes held a wariness that no child should know. But what struck Clara most was the hollow look in his face, the way his cheekbones stood out sharp against his skin. "I'm sorry to bother you, ma'am," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was wondering if maybe you had something to eat." His words came out in small puffs of vapor in the cold air, and Clara noticed he was shivering violently. In that moment, Clara felt something shift inside her. A maternal instinct she thought had gone dormant years ago surged back to life. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, opening the door wider. "Please, coming out of the cold." The boy hesitated, taking half a step back. "I don't want to be any trouble. Just a little food, if you can spare it." Clara's heart ached at his caution. "You're no trouble at all. I'm making dinner right now, and I'd love some company." She kept her voice gentle, steady, like coaxing a frightened animal. "I'm Clara. What's your name?" "Miguel," he replied, still hovering on the threshold. "Well, Miguel, I've got a warm kitchen and plenty of food. Would you like to come in and get warm while I fix you something to eat?" He looked over his shoulder at the darkening street, then back at Clara's kind face. Something in her expression must have reassured him, because he gave a small nod and stepped inside. Clara closed the door against the winter wind and quickly retrieved a thick blanket from the hall closet. "Here," she said, draping it around his shoulders. "Let's get you warm first." As she guided him toward the kitchen, she noticed more details that made her stomach clench. The unnatural distension of his belly against his thin frame, the way he walked with careful, pained steps, the dirt ground into his clothing and under his fingernails. This wasn't a child who had missed a meal or two. This was a child in serious trouble. The kitchen light revealed what the porch's dim bulb had hidden. Fading bruises along his jawline, partially obscured by several days' worth of dirt. Clara felt anger flare in her chest, but kept her voice calm and warm. "How about some soup to start? I've got chicken noodle warming on the stove." Miguel nodded eagerly, then seemed to catch himself, trying to appear more reserved. "Yes, please, ma'am." As Clara ladled the soup into a bowl, she watched Miguel from the corner of her eye. He stood awkwardly by the kitchen table, clutching the blanket around himself, his eyes darting between her and the exits. She recognized the look. It was the same one she'd seen in the faces of abused animals at the shelter where she volunteered. "Sit down, sweetheart," she said, placing the bowl and a spoon on the table. "There's plenty more where that came from." Miguel slid into the chair and stared at the steaming bowl as if it might disappear. When Clara nodded encouragingly, he picked up the spoon with trembling fingers and began to eat. His first few bites were cautious, but soon he was eating with the desperate speed of someone who didn't know when their next meal would come. "Slow down a bit, dear," Clara advised gently. "You don't want to make yourself sick. The food isn't going anywhere." He flushed and forced himself to eat more slowly, but his eyes never left the bowl. Clara busied herself at the counter, continuing to chop vegetables while giving him space. Her mind raced with questions, but she knew better than to overwhelm him with them now. First, she needed to earn his trust. As she worked, she began to hum along with the carol on the radio, keeping her movements deliberate and calm. Gradually, she could see some of the tension leaving Miguel's shoulders. When he finished the soup, she was ready with a plate of crackers and cheese. "Would you like some more soup?" she asked, and his eyes lit up before he could hide it. "Yes, please," he whispered. If it's really okay." "Of course it is." She refilled his bowl, adding an extra ladle full of noodles. "You know, I always cook too much for just myself. It's nice to have someone to share it with." As Miguel ate his second bowl, Clara noticed that his hands had stopped shaking, though his posture remained vigilant. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat down, careful to move slowly and keep her hands visible on the table. "Miguel," she said softly, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know that you're safe here. No one is going to hurt you." She waited until he met her eyes before continuing. "Are you running from someone?" His spoon clattered against the bowl, and for a moment, Clara thought he might bolt. But then his shoulders slumped, and he gave a tiny nod. "Can you tell me about it?" Miguel stared into his soup for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet Clara had to lean forward to hear him. "There's this place, an old building. Some men there, they say they're helping kids like me, kids without families. But they're not helping. They are bad men." Clara felt her throat tighten. "How long have you been there?" "I don't know. A few months, maybe." He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly. "There are other kids, too. The men, they make us." His voice caught, and he shook his head. "It's okay," Clara said quickly. "You don't have to tell me everything right now." She reached across the table, moving slowly, and placed her hand palm up in front of him. "But I want you to know that I'm going to help you. If you'll let me." Miguel stared at her open hand for what felt like an eternity. Then, with the same caution he'd shown at her door, he placed his small hand in hers. His fingers were ice-cold despite the warm soup, and Clara gently closed her hand around them. "Thank you," he whispered, and Clara saw tears beginning to well in his eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her own voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to thank me. Not for this. Not ever." Outside, the winter wind howled against the windows, but in Clara's kitchen, something fragile and precious was beginning to take root. As Miguel's tears finally began to fall, Clara moved to his side of the table and, very carefully, drew him into her arms. He stiffened for a moment, before collapsing against her, his thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Clara held him, rocking slightly as she had done with her own son so many years ago, and made a silent promise. This child had found his way to her door on Christmas Eve, and she would move heaven and earth to keep him safe. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she knew with absolute certainty that her life had changed forever in the space of a single knock at the door. As Miguel's tears subsided, Clara felt a fierce protectiveness well up inside her. His small frame trembled against her, and she could feel each of his ribs through the thin fabric of his shirt. The kitchen clock continued its steady ticking, marking the moments as they sat there in the growing darkness. Outside, the first few snowflakes of the evening began to fall, dancing past the window in lazy spirals. Clara knew she should call the authorities immediately, but something held her back. Years of volunteering at the women's shelter had taught her how crucial these first moments of trust could be. One wrong move now might send Miguel running back into the cold, back to whatever horrors he'd managed to escape. "Would you like to get cleaned up?" she asked softly, running a gentle hand over his matted hair. "I have some warm clothes that might fit you. They belong to my grandson Tommy, but he's outgrown them now." Miguel pulled back slightly, wiping his face with the corner of the blanket. "I don't want to make a mess," he mumbled, looking down at his dirty clothes with shame. "Nonsense," Clara said firmly. "Nothing that can't be cleaned up. Come on, let's get you warm and comfortable." She led him up the narrow staircase to the bathroom, moving slowly to accommodate his careful steps. The fluorescent light revealed more details she hadn't noticed before, small circular burns on his forearms, a pattern too regular to be accidental. Clara swallowed her rage, keeping her voice steady as she showed him how to work the shower. "Take as long as you need," she said, placing a stack of clean towels on the counter. "I'll leave some clothes outside the door. When you're done, we can see about getting some real food into you." While the shower ran, Clara moved quickly through the house. She retrieved a box of Tommy's old clothes from the attic, selecting the warmest items she could find. Then she called her friend Margaret, a retired nurse who lived 3 blocks away. "I need your help," she said quietly into the phone, "but you have to promise to be discreet." Margaret must have heard something in her voice, because she agreed without hesitation. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Clara had just finished laying out the clothes when the water stopped. "Miguel?" she called through the door. "I'm leaving some clothes here. They might be a bit big, but they're clean and warm." She heard a muffled thank you and retreated downstairs to give him privacy. Margaret arrived while Clara was pulling together a more substantial meal. Simple foods that wouldn't overwhelm a stomach and used to regular eating. "Clara Thompson," Margaret said as she stepped into the kitchen, shaking snow from her coat. "What kind of trouble have you gotten yourself into now?" Before Clara could answer, they heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Miguel appeared in the doorway, swimming in Tommy's old sweater and jeans. Clean and properly lit, he looked even younger than Clara had initially thought. His dark hair, now free of dirt, curled damply around his ears, and his skin was a shade lighter under the grime. The bruises on his face stood out more starkly. Margaret's sharp intake of breath was the only indication of her shock. Like Clara, she'd seen enough in her years of nursing to know how to school her expression. "Miguel, this is my friend Margaret," Clara said smoothly. "She's a nurse, and I thought she might take a look at you, make sure you're okay. Would that be all right?" Miguel's eyes darted between the two women. "Take." Into the door. Clara held her breath, afraid he might run, but then he gave a small nod. "You're very brave," Margaret said, her voice warm but professional. She set her medical bag on the table. "Would you like Clara to stay with you while I check you over?" Another nod, more decisive this time. Clara pulled out a chair for him, positioning herself so he could see both her and the exits clearly. Margaret's examination was gentle and thorough. She checked his temperature, listened to his breathing, and carefully documented his injuries. When she pressed lightly on his distended abdomen, Miguel winced. "How long has it been since you've had regular meals, sweetheart?" Margaret asked. "Miguel, we got food sometimes, when we did what they wanted." The two women exchanged a glance over his head. Margaret continued her examination, speaking softly about what she was doing, asking careful questions about pain and discomfort. When she finished, she pulled Clara aside while Miguel ate the sandwich Clara had prepared. Malnutrition, dehydration, multiple contusions in various stages of healing, Margaret listed quietly. "Those burns, Clara, this is serious. We need to call the police." "I know," Clara whispered back. "But there are other children there. If we spook him now?" Margaret's lips thinned, but she nodded. 24 hours, not a minute more. He needs proper medical attention, and those other kids need help. "Agreed. Can you stay tonight? I might need backup when I make the call." Margaret squeezed her arm. "Of course. I'll call John. Tell him not to wait up." As they turned back to the kitchen, they found Miguel had fallen asleep at the table, his head pillowed on his arms. The half-eaten sandwich sat forgotten beside him. "Poor little mite," Margaret murmured. "He's exhausted himself." Together, they managed to carry him to the couch without waking him. Clara covered him with a warm quilt, while Margaret set up and for to help with the dehydration. As they sat watching him sleep, Clara felt something shift in her heart. A space she thought had died with Robert coming alive again. The snow continued to fall outside, coating the world in silence. In the soft glow of the Christmas tree lights, Clara watched Miguel's chest rise and fall, each breath a small miracle. She didn't know what the morning would bring, what battles lay ahead, but she knew with absolute certainty that she would fight them all. This child had found his way to her door, and perhaps, in saving him, she would save herself as well. The clock struck midnight, marking the official start of Christmas Day. Clara reached out and gently smoothed Miguel's hair back from his forehead, her touch feather-light to avoid waking him. His face, relaxed in sleep, looked peaceful for the first time since she'd met him. Despite the circumstances, or perhaps because of them, Clara felt a profound sense of purpose settling over her. Margaret dozed in the armchair, her nurse's instincts keeping her partially alert even in sleep. The four dripped steadily, beginning the long process of rebuilding what neglect had torn down. Outside, the world was transformed by snow, making everything clean and new. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, police reports and social workers' questions and decisions. But for now, in this quiet moment between Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, Clara allowed herself to hope. She thought of the empty rooms upstairs, the quiet days that had stretched endlessly before her just hours ago. How quickly life could change, turning on a single moment of kindness. As if sensing her thoughts, Miguel stirred slightly in his sleep, his hand clutching the quilt tighter. Clara hummed softly, an old lullaby she used to sing to James, and watched as Miguel settled back into deeper sleep. The night deepened, and Clara kept her vigil. She thought about the other children Miguel had mentioned, still trapped in that terrible place. Her mind began forming plans, considering options, drawing on connections from her years of community work. She would need help, legal help, medical help, support from her neighbors and friends. But looking at Miguel's sleeping face, she knew it would be worth any effort, any cost. The Christmas tree lights cast soft shadows on the wall, and somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring, carrying the sound of hope across the snow-covered city. Clara settled deeper into her chair, prepared to watch over Miguel until morning. After all, isn't this what Christmas was truly about? Not the presents or the decorations, but the simple act of opening one's door to someone in need, of sharing whatever warmth and love one had to give. As the bells faded into silence, Clara whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. This Christmas would be different from any she had known before, but perhaps it would be the most meaningful of all. In helping Miguel find his way home, she might just find her own path forward as well. The pre-dawn light was just beginning to creep through the windows when Miguel stirred. Clara, who had dozed off briefly in her chair, was instantly alert. She watched as awareness slowly returned to his face. First confusion, then a flash of fear, before recognition and relief softened his features. "Good morning," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" Miguel blinked, his eyes moving from Clara to Margaret, who was already checking the four-line. "Better," he whispered, though his voice was rough with sleep. I thought maybe I dreamed it all." "No dream, sweetheart," Clara assured him. "You're safe here." Margaret finished her examination with practiced efficiency. "Your color's looking better already," she announced. "Think you could manage some breakfast?" At the mention of food, Miguel's stomach growled audibly, causing a faint blush to color his cheeks. Clara was already moving toward the kitchen, grateful to see this small sign of normal childhood embarrassment. It felt like progress somehow. "How about some oatmeal to start?" she called over her shoulder. "We need to be careful with your stomach for a few days." While Clara prepared breakfast, she could hear Margaret's gentle voice asking Miguel more questions about his health, his sleeping patterns, his pain levels. The boy's responses were quiet, but clearer than they had been the night before. The few hours of proper rest and the four fluids had already made a difference. The morning light revealed new details of Clara's living room that Miguel hadn't noticed in the darkness of the previous night. His eyes wandered over the family photos on the walls, the well-worn furniture that spoke of years of use and care, the Christmas tree with its mismatched ornaments, each presumably holding its own story. Clara returned with 3 bowls of oatmeal, topped with a drizzle of honey and a sprinkle of cinnamon. She had deliberately served small portions, remembering Margaret's warnings about overwhelming his system. As they ate, she began to carefully broach the subject they couldn't avoid any longer. "Miguel," she started, keeping her voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk about getting help for the other children, the ones still in that place." His spoon paused halfway to his mouth, fear flickering across his face. "They'll hurt them if they know I told." "Not if we do this right," Margaret interjected. "We have friends who know how to handle situations like this. People who can help make sure everyone stays safe." Clara nodded. "My friend David is a police officer. He's helped other children before, children who were being hurt. He knows how to be careful, how to protect people. Miguel set his spoon down, his hands trembling slightly. There's 6 of them, he said finally. The youngest is only 5. His voice broke on the last word. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. You're very brave to tell us this. You're helping to save them. You know that, right? Tears welled in his eye. Yes again, but this time they seemed different. Not tears of fear or pain, but of relief, perhaps even hope. Will they go to places like this? With people like you? The question caught Clara off guard, making her heart twist in her chest. Before she could respond, a knock at the door made them all jump. Margaret moved to answer it while Clara stayed with Miguel, who had gone rigid with fear. It's just David, Margaret called from the hallway. I called him earlier. Officer David Chin entered the room with deliberate casualness, wearing civilian clothes rather than his uniform. His kind face and gentle demeanor had always made him good at handling sensitive cases, which was why Clara had specifically asked for him. Good morning, he said, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. I hear you folks could use some help. Over the next hour, with infinite patience and care, David drew out Miguel's story. Clara held the boy's hand throughout, feeling every tremor that passed through him as he described the abandoned building, the men who kept them there, the things they were forced to do. David took notes without commentary, though Clara could see the tension in his jaw. You've done really well, Miguel, David said when the boy had finished. This information is going to help us get everyone out safely. But I need you to understand something. We have to move quickly now. Today. Can you help us do that? Miguel looked at Clara, searching her face for reassurance. She squeezed his hand. Whatever happens, she promised, you won't have to go back there. Ever. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. David made calls, setting in motion a carefully coordinated operation. Social services were notified, medical teams were put on standby, and plainclothes officers began discreet surveillance of the building Miguel had described. Clara and Margaret worked together to prepare Miguel for what would come next. The hospital visit that couldn't be avoided, the questions he would need to answer, the examinations that would be necessary to document everything that had been done to him. Through it all, Miguel remained closer to Clara's side, as if she had become his anchor in a storm of uncertainty. As the morning wore on, more of Clara's neighbors began to notice the unusual activity around her house. Mrs. Patterson from next door appeared with a casserole just because, though her concerned eyes took in the sight of Miguel with understanding. Mr. Rodriguez from across the street offered his services as a translator if needed, having noticed Miguel's slight accent. By noon, David returned with news. The operation had been successful. All 6 children had been rescued, and 3 men were in custody. Miguel broke down at this information, sobbing with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Clara held him, her own tears falling silently into his hair. First, we need to get you to the hospital, young man. Clara can come with you if you'd like. Miguel nodded, not loosening his grip on Clara's hand. As they prepared to leave, Clara looked around her home, at the half-eaten breakfast, the rumpled blankets on the couch, the Christmas tree still twinkling in the corner. In less than 24 hours, her quiet, orderly life had been completely upended. And yet, she felt more alive than she had in years. The winter sun was high in the sky now, making the snow gleam like diamonds. As they walked to David's car, Miguel still holding tight to her hand, Clara thought about the long road ahead. There would be challenges, certainly her age, her single status, the trauma Miguel would need to work through. But looking down at this brave, resilient child who had somehow found his way to her door, she knew with absolute certainty that they would face it all together. This Christmas, which had started in solitude and routine, had brought her the most unexpected and precious gift of all, the chance to be needed, to love, to make a difference in a child's life. As they drove through the snow-covered streets toward the hospital, Clara silently renewed her promise to Miguel. Whatever came next, she would be there, helping him rebuild his life one day at a time, creating a new kind of family forged in trust and healing. The city passed by outside the car windows, its holiday decorations somehow more meaningful now. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring again, their sound carrying across the snow-covered landscape like a promise of hope and new beginnings. The church bell's echoes faded into the winter morning as David's car made its way through the snow-covered streets towards St. Mary's Hospital. Clara noticed Miguel's grip tightening on her hand as the hospital's imposing facade came into view. The building's modern glass and steel structure loomed against the bright winter sky, its windows reflecting the morning sunlight like countless mirrors. "It's going to be all right," Clara whispered, giving his small hand a reassuring squeeze. "I'll be with you the whole time." The emergency department was surprisingly quiet for Christmas morning. Perhaps even accidents and illnesses respected the holiday, Clara thought wryly. David had called ahead, so they were expected. A team of medical professionals was waiting, led by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a pediatric specialist with experience in trauma cases. "Hello, Miguel," Dr. Martinez said softly, kneeling down to his eye level. "I'm Dr. Sarah. Would you like to come with me, so we can make sure you're healthy? Clara can come too." Miguel looked up at Clara, who nodded encouragingly. Together, they followed Dr. Martinez through the sterile corridors to a private examination room decorated with cheerful murals of jungle animals. The doctor's manner was gentle but efficient as she began her examination, explaining each step before she took it. Clara watched as Miguel's medical history unfolded through X-rays, blood tests, and careful documentation of his injuries. Each revelation added another layer to the horror of what he had endured, but also reinforced her determination to help him heal. The worst moment came when they had to photograph the burns and bruises. Miguel tried to be brave, but silent tears rolled down his cheeks as each mark was measured and recorded. Throughout the examination, Clara maintained a steady stream of quiet encouragement, telling Miguel stories about her garden, her volunteering at the animal shelter, anything to distract him from the clinical procedures. She described the family of cardinals that visited her bird feeder every morning, promising to show them to him when they returned home. The word home slipped out naturally, and she saw Miguel's eyes light up at the sound of it. As the morning wore on, social workers came and went, conducting preliminary interviews and beginning the complex process of establishing Miguel's legal status. The fact that he had no documented family history complicated matters, but Clara was surprised to find this worked in her favor. With no competing claims for custody, temporary emergency placement would be easier to arrange. TS were on inside, and through the window, she could see movement. Margaret had promised to coordinate with the neighbors to prepare for their return. "Welcome home," Clara whispered as she helped Miguel from the car. He leaned against her, still groggy from the medication, but managed a small smile. The porch light cast a warm glow on the fresh snow as they made their way to the front door. Behind them, Christmas Day was drawing to a close, but Clara knew this was just the beginning. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The empty rooms upstairs would fill with life again, the quiet halls with the sound of footsteps. Most importantly, two lonely hearts had found each other on a cold winter night, proving that sometimes the greatest miracles come in the most unexpected ways. As Clara opened the front door, the warmth of home embraced them both. The entryway glowed with soft lamplight, and the scent of fresh-baked cookies wafted from the kitchen. Margaret had clearly rallied the neighbors. There were new blankets on the couch, a small pile of emergency supplies on the coffee table, and a plate of sandwiches waiting on the kitchen counter. "Are all these people here for me?" Miguel whispered, his eyes wide as he took in the evidence of care and preparation. "They're here for both of us," Clara replied, helping him remove his coat. "That's what community means, people helping people." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Clara's spare room, which had served as little more than storage since James moved out, was transformed into a proper bedroom for Miguel. Neighbors appeared throughout the day, bringing donations of clothes, books, and toys. Mr. Rodriguez's wife, Elena, arrived with bags of groceries and spent an afternoon teaching Clara how to cook some of Miguel's favorite dishes from his early childhood, the few happy memories he could recall. The nights were harder. Miguel's sleep was haunted by nightmares, and Clara quickly learned to recognize the small sounds that preceded his terrors. She would sit with him, sometimes for hours, humming lullabies and telling stories until his breathing steadied. During one particularly difficult night, he finally spoke about his mother, a fading memory of warm hands and a soft voice, lost to illness when he was very young. I used to pretend she was looking for me, he confessed in the darkness. That someday she'd find me and take me away from there. Clara gathered him close, her heart breaking. She would be so proud of how brave you've been, she whispered. So proud of how you helped save the other children. The first week brought a stream of official visitors, social workers, psychologists, legal representatives. Clara organized everything meticulously, creating files and keeping detailed notes. Her years of volunteer work had taught her the importance of documentation. Miguel handled the interviews with growing confidence, though he still held tight to Clara's hand during the harder questions. Dr. Martinez made house calls to check on Miguel's recovery, bringing with her a specialized nutrition plan and exercises to help rebuild his strength. The physical therapy sessions became a routine they shared, Clara participating alongside Miguel to make it feel more like play than treatment. News about the arrest spread through the community. Clara carefully shielded Miguel from the worst of the details, but she couldn't hide the reporters who occasionally parked at the end of their street. David increased patrols in the neighborhood, and Clara's neighbors formed an informal watch system, protecting Miguel's privacy with fierce determination. The other children rescued that day were never far from their thoughts. Clara kept in touch with their cases through Ms. Walker and slowly, carefully, began arranging supervised visits. The first reunion was emotional. Tears and hugs, and a profound relief at seeing each other safe. The youngest Sarah, threw herself into Miguel's arms, and Clara saw him transform from a victim into a protector, comforting the smaller child with gentle words. As January crept in, they began discussing school. Miguel's education had been spotty at best, but testing revealed a quick mind hungry for knowledge. Clara spent evenings working with him, filling in gaps in his learning, marveling at his determination to catch up. They developed a ritual of hot chocolate and math problems, turning education into a shared adventure. The home study process continued, with inspectors examining every aspect of Clara's life and home. She met each requirement methodically, attending parenting classes, making recommended modifications to the house, building a support network of care providers. Miguel watched these preparations with a mixture of hope and anxiety, still afraid to believe fully in permanence. One evening, as they sat together on the porch swing watching the sunset, Miguel asked the question he'd been holding back. What if they say no? What if they say I can't stay? Clara pulled him closer. Then we'll appeal. We'll fight. I won't give up, Miguel. Not ever. He was quiet for a moment, considering this. I've never had anyone fight for me before, he said finally. Well, now you have a whole army, Clara replied, thinking of their neighbors, the medical team, the social workers who had become advocates, and most importantly, his newfound friends, the other survivors who understood his journey. That night, as Clara tucked Miguel into bed, a ritual that neither of them tired of, she noticed something different in his room. On the wall beside his bed, he had carefully taped a calendar. Each day was marked with a small star, counting forward to the court date when their temporary arrangement might become permanent. Is it okay? He asked anxiously, seeing her notice it. Mrs. Patterson helped me make it. Clara touched one of the stars gently. It's perfect, she said. And you know what? Let's add something special to each day. Not just counting down, but counting up all the good things that happen. Together, they began filling in the calendar squares. First day without nightmares. Finished chapter book. Made cookies with Elena. Beat Clara at chess. Small victories, perhaps, but each one a step toward healing, toward trust, toward family. As she turned out the light, Clara paused in the doorway, watching Miguel settle into sleep. The stuffed bear from the hospital, now named Hope, was tucked under his arm, and his face was peaceful in the soft glow of his nightlight. Outside, winter stars glittered in a clear sky, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, its sound carrying memories of that first Christmas Eve when a knock at the door had changed everything. The house settled around them, creaking gently as old houses do, but it was no longer a lonely sound. These walls, which had once echoed with emptiness, now held something precious, the beginning of a new story, written in moments of trust and courage, in small victories and shared dreams, in the simple, profound miracle of two hearts finding home in each other. The house's gentle sounds had become a symphony of comfort, each creak and settling noise now familiar and reassuring. Clara sat in her reading chair by the window, watching the stars and reflecting on how quickly life could change. The calendar on Miguel's wall wasn't just marking time. It was documenting a transformation, one small victory at a time. The next morning brought new challenges and triumphs. Miguel woke early, eager to help Clara with breakfast, a routine they'd established that gave him a sense of purpose and belonging. As they worked together in the kitchen, Clara noticed how his movements had become more confident, less hesitant. He no longer flinched at sudden noises or kept his eyes constantly fixed on the exits. "I was thinking," Clara said as she showed him how to flip pancakes without breaking them, "that maybe we could paint your room this weekend. Make it really yours." Miguel's face lit up. "Could we make it blue? Like the sky?" "Any color you want," Clara promised. "We could even add some clouds if you'd like. Mrs. Patterson used to be an art teacher. I bet she'd help us." The mention of their neighbor brought a smile to Miguel's face. Over the past weeks, he'd begun to form connections with the community. Mrs. Patterson taught him to draw during afternoon art sessions. Mr. Rodriguez helped him practice his Spanish, which had grown rusty during his years of captivity. Even grumpy old Mr. Jenkins from down the street had warmed to the boy, sharing stories about his days as a pilot and promising to take Miguel to the Air Museum when he was stronger. The psychological evaluations continued, but now Miguel approached them with determination rather than fear. His therapist, Dr. Reynolds, had a way of turning difficult conversations into opportunities for growth. Together, they worked through the trauma using art therapy, play therapy, and gradually, talk therapy. Clara attended some sessions, learning how to better support Miguel's healing journey. One breakthrough came during a particularly challenging therapy session. Miguel had been working on a clay sculpture, his fingers methodically shaping the material as he spoke about his time in captivity. Suddenly, he looked up at Clara with tears in his eyes. "I didn't think anyone would ever want me," he confessed. "They told us we were worthless, that no one would look for us, that no one would care." Clara moved to his side, careful not to disrupt the safe space of the therapy room. "They were wrong," she said firmly. "So wrong. You are precious, Miguel. You always were." Dr. Reynolds watched their interaction with approval, noting how Miguel leaned into Clara's comfort without losing his sense of self. It was a delicate balance, allowing him to be vulnerable while helping him build strength, teaching him that acceptance of past pain didn't diminish his present worth. The clay sculpture Miguel created that day became a centerpiece in their home, a pair of hands releasing a bird into flight. Clara placed it on the mantel, where the morning sun made the glaze shimmer like hope given form. As January melted into February, their life together fell into comfortable patterns. Mornings began with breakfast and simple chores, followed by homeschooling sessions while they waited for placement in a proper school program. Afternoons were filled with therapy appointments, medical checkups, and increasingly, play dates with the other rescued children who had become like extended family. The court date for permanent custody grew closer, marked by ever brighter stars on Miguel's calendar. Clara worked tirelessly to meet every requirement, building a case that would prove their bond was meant to be permanent. Her age remained a concern for some officials, but her dedication and Miguel's obvious attachment to her worked in their favor. One evening, as they sat working on a puzzle together, another healing activity recommended by Dr. Reynolds, Miguel asked about Clara's own family. "Your son, James," he said carefully, placing a piece in the growing picture. "Do you think he'll like me?" Clara's heart swelled at the question. "He already does," she assured him. "We video chat every week while you're at therapy, remember? He's been asking when he can come visit." Miguel nodded, concentrating on fitting another piece. "And Tommy? Will he be mad that I'm using his old room?" "Oh, sweetheart," Clara said, setting down her puzzle piece. "Tommy's been outgrowing those toys and clothes for years. He's thrilled they're being used by someone who appreciates them. In fact," she smiled, remembering her last conversation with James, "they're planning to come for spring break." Tommy's already talking about showing you how to play baseball. The puzzle piece in Mig. Yule's hand trembled slightly. A real family, he whispered, almost to himself. Yes, Clara confirmed, pulling him close. A real family. Different from some, maybe, but no less real for being chosen rather than born. That night, after Miguel had gone to bed, Clara sat at her kitchen table, reviewing their journey. The initial emergency placement papers were now accompanied by inches of documentation. Medical records showing his improving health, therapy notes marking his progress, school evaluation results revealing his academic potential. Each paper told part of their story, but the real evidence was in the little things. The sound of Miguel's laughter echoing through the house, the artwork covering his bedroom walls, the way he had begun to call out, "Love you," before going to sleep. The house creaked and settled around them, but now it was the sound of a home breathing with life and love. The stars continued their eternal dance across the winter sky, witnesses to the quiet miracle of healing that was taking place within these walls. In the room upstairs, Miguel slept peacefully, his dreams no longer haunted by the past, but filled with visions of the future. A future that grew brighter with each star added to his calendar. Each small step toward permanence. Each moment of belonging in this place they now shared. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new victories, new opportunities for growth. But for now, in this quiet moment, Clara gave thanks for the knock on her door that had changed everything, for the courage of a little boy who dared to trust again, and for the infinite ways love could create family from the broken pieces of two lonely hearts.